The first city died without a sound, because sound cannot exist in vacuum, and the kaiju came from orbit, not from the sea, as the old warnings had predicted. It broke atmosphere like a falling continent, gravity screaming around it, and the defense grid failed before anyone could finish the word impossible. Sensors called it an extinction-class bioform, older than recorded spaceflight, larger than doctrine allowed for, and entirely uninterested in surrender. Fleets burned, stations cracked. The monster did not slow. It moved with purpose, not hunger, not rage, but something far worse: intent. Admirals across human space watched their screens go dark one by one, and if you are listening to this story now, you already know how it felt, because that same tightness in your chest is why people keep coming back to stories like this, hoping for a different ending, hoping someone remembers what happens next. They called it Tethys Vault, a name borrowed from ancient oceans and locked doors because nobody wanted to say monster on an open channel. It was the size of a mountain range coiled into a shape that physics had not agreed to yet, plated in bone-black armor that drank light and stitched itself back together after every impact. Rail cannons shattered against it, antimatter lances scarred it and were forgotten. When it screamed, planets felt it through tectonic plates, and people felt it in their teeth. Alien empires that had survived 1,000 wars folded their banners and ran. Humanity stayed, not because it was brave, but because evacuation clocks do not care about courage. By day 3, the kaiju had crossed the inner corridor, and the civilian lanes were chaos. Emergency traffic choked the stars as evacuation shuttles leapt blind, jumping with children still buckled and engines still on fire. One of those shuttles was the Mercy 13, a converted hospital transport never meant to see combat, piloted by a tired reservist and carrying 37 souls who did not make the cut for priority lanes. Among them was Mara Elwood, former schoolteacher, current refugee, holding her infant son against her chest while alarms told her truths she already knew. The jump misfired. Space twisted. The Mercy 13 screamed and fell out of reality near a dead moon that should not have been there. The moon was not dead. It was a nest. The crash tore the shuttle open like a dropped egg and scattered the survivors across a valley of obsidian stone and steaming vents. Mara came to with blood in her mouth and her son crying, that raw, panicked sound every parent knows as a countdown. She did not hear the monster at first. She felt it. The ground pulsed, slow and heavy, like a heart the size of a world. When she looked up, she saw the silhouette blotting out the stars, and somewhere in her mind a calm voice listed all the reasons she should not move, should not breathe, should not exist here at all. Then she heard another cry. It was wrong in scale, deeper, wet, torn by pain, and it echoed from a fissure nearby. The monster loomed over that place, its colossal frame hunched in a posture that did not match any threat profile. Its movements were frantic, precise, careful, as if afraid of breaking something already broken. Sensors would later show a wound along its lower plates, a burn pattern consistent with human antimatter, a cruel irony written into history. Beneath it, something small shifted and cried again. Mara's training was not military. It was bedtime routines and scraped knees and the 1,000 small mercies that keep tiny humans alive. Her hands moved before her fear caught up. She crawled toward the sound, pressing her son close, humming because that is what she did when the world became too loud. The melody was old, taught by her mother, and it shook in her throat as the ground trembled. She did not look at the monster. She looked at the child-shaped shadow curled in the stone, the kaiju young, its armor cracked, fluid steaming, its cry breaking into ragged gasps. The universe narrowed. There was only a wounded baby and a mother with nothing left to lose. She sang. Above them,
Tethys Vault reared, sensors flaring across the sector as it registered the movement, the sound, the impossible proximity of a human within its kill radius. Every surviving fleet trained weapons on the moon, fingers hovering over final orders, analysts begging for permission to fire while they still could. Somewhere, someone whispered that if this story ever got told, they hoped people would remember this moment, because this is where everything went wrong, or right, depending on who you ask. Mara reached the fissure and sat, back against the warm stone, and rocked both children, her own and the impossible one, her voice steadying as exhaustion bled into resolve. The kaiju young quieted, its breaths evening, its massive eye flickering shut. The monster froze, its scream died in its throat. Across human space, sensors registered the unthinkable. The extinction event had stopped moving. If you're still listening, if your finger hasn't drifted away yet, stay with me, because this is the part where the galaxy realized it had misunderstood humanity completely. And the monster realized something else entirely. And when Tethys Vault lowered its head for the first time in recorded history, every weapon in orbit lost its target at once.
No one fired because no one could agree on what they were seeing, and because firing would have meant admitting they understood it, and they didn't. The monster that had erased armadas now stood motionless above a shattered moon, its vast silhouette bowed, its lethal vectors collapsing into stillness. Long-range sensors screamed contradictions. Threat algorithms oscillated between extinction and null. Somewhere in the Coalition war room, a commander whispered that this was a feint, a biological trick, a pause before annihilation. Another commander whispered something closer to the truth, that the monster was listening. Mara did not know any of that. She knew only that the larger child had stopped crying, and that her own son had gone quiet too, his tiny fingers clutching fabric and fate. She kept singing because stopping felt dangerous, because silence felt like an invitation for fear to return. Her voice carried through the fissure and into the open air, thin and human and absurdly fragile against the bulk of Tethys Vault. The melody wove through steam and stone and ancient nerves that had never heard anything like it. The kaiju's great eye opened, not in anger, but in focus, and fixed on her. Up close, the monster was not rage given form. It was scarred. Its armor bore marks older than the human species, etched by weapons and worlds long gone. Its breathing shuddered with restraint, every exhale a controlled catastrophe. It extended a limb the size of a tower and stopped, claws hovering meters from Mara's head, trembling. The universe waited. In orbit, targeting reticles blinked red and then yellow as systems lost predictive confidence. Analysts shouted for confirmation that never came. The kaiju young stirred, pressed closer to Mara's side, and made a sound that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever stayed up all night with a feverish child. Pain softened into need. Mara shifted, wincing as broken ribs protested, and adjusted the blanket she had salvaged from the wreck. She spoke then, quietly, not to the monster, not to the galaxy, but to the child. "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe." The translator in her implant tried and failed to assign meaning to what the kaiju heard, but meaning arrived anyway, bypassing language and doctrine and fear. The monster withdrew its claw and lowered itself further, the ground cracking as its mass redistributed. This was not submission, it was accommodation, a choice. In the war room, an alien ambassador fainted. On a carrier bridge, a human gunner laughed once, hysterical, and then cried. Someone began recording, hands shaking, knowing that whatever this was would define history if anyone survived to tell it. If you're listening to this now, you already know that people shared that recording later, passing it along not as proof of victory, but as proof of something else,
something worth holding on to.
Mara's song faltered when exhaustion finally bit through adrenaline. Her voice cracked, then steadied as she shifted to speaking, telling stories she had told 100 times before about trains and stars and a rabbit who was very brave even when he was afraid. The kaiju young's breathing deepened, its wounds knit slowly, bone-light sealing fractures with patient inevitability. Above them, Tethys Vault watched, its vast intelligence tracing patterns it had not expected to find in this cycle of destruction. Then, the sky changed. A coalition strike group dropped out of warp on the far side of the moon, too late for orders to stop them from arriving, too early to pretend they hadn't seen the threat matrix stabilize into something unprecedented. Their admiral, old and careful, took one look at the feeds and ordered weapons cold, a decision that would end his career or save it, depending on how the next minutes unfolded. A younger captain did not wait. Fear has a voice, and it sounds like a trigger. The shot was small by wartime standards, a precision lance meant to test a reaction, to confirm a theory, to regain control. It grazed the kaiju's flank and scorched ancient armor. The monster flinched. The ground screamed. The kaiju young cried out, sharp and sudden, pain echoing through the fissure like glass breaking. Mara stopped singing and stood. She did not think about scale or survival, or the fact that the thing above her could erase her with a thought. She stepped out from the fissure and raised a hand, palm out, the universal gesture of stop that predates language. She shouted, her voice raw and furious, at the sky. "Don't!" The word carried, amplified by the impossible stillness that followed. On 1,000 bridges, people held their breath. Tethys Vault rose, not in attack but in defense, its bulk interposing between the fissure and the stars. It turned its head toward the strike group, eyes burning with something colder than rage. Across the sector, warning systems lit up with a new designation that no manual contained. The monster had chosen a side, and the galaxy had just given it a reason to remember why it was feared. The warning came too late for anyone who needed it. When Tethys Vault shifted its mass into a defensive posture, space itself seemed to recoil, gravity wells flexing as if the universe were bracing for impact. The coalition strike group scrambled, thrusters flaring, commanders shouting for discipline and restraint in voices that cracked under the weight of what they had provoked. The monster did not charge, it did not roar. It did something far more terrifying. It calculated. Across the monster's armored hide, ancient bioluminescent lines ignited, not as weapons but as signals, cascading in patterns that matched no known language, yet resonated with every sensor suite in range. Astrophysicists would later argue that Tethys Vault was not merely a creature, but a custodian, a living failsafe designed by a civilization that had faced extinction and refused to leave the universe unguarded. In that moment, all anyone knew was that the kaiju was calling something, answering something. Mara felt it in her bones, a pressure like the deep ocean, steady and immense. She backed into the fissure, shielding both children, her heart pounding with the clarity that comes when fear gives way to purpose. She did not look at the sky again. She looked at the kaiju young and whispered reassurance, hands gentle, voice low. She sang again, not loudly, but with the stubborn insistence of a lullaby meant to outlast storms. The response arrived as a distortion, a bending of starlight that made navigation systems weep. From the far dark, shapes emerged that had no business being near a human evacuation zone. Ancient guardians or siblings or echoes of a design too old for modern names. They were not many, but they were enough. The coalition's threat displays bloomed into red, then went blank as systems failed to categorize the new arrivals. Panic rippled through command channels. Someone shouted to fire everything. Someone else cut the channel. Tethys Vault did not unleash them. It dismissed them.
With a gesture that bent the moon's crust, the monster sent a signal that rolled like thunder across the void. The answering shapes halted, their advance arrested by a command older than fear. They withdrew, folding back into the dark with the obedience of tools returned to their racks. The message was clear to anyone who understood power. This was not escalation, this was restraint. The Coalition Admiral seized the moment, ordering a full ceasefire and broadcasting a plea on every frequency, stripped of rhetoric and pride. "We will stand down. We will not fire. We are listening." The words were clumsy, but they mattered. Across alien councils and human worlds, leaders leaned forward, realizing that diplomacy had just acquired a new definition.
On the moon, the kaiju lowered itself again, massive bulk settling into the rock like a mountain choosing to rest. It turned its attention back to the fissure, to the small human and the two children whose breaths now synced in a fragile harmony. The monster extended a limb, not as a threat, but as an offering, placing something on the stone with care that bordered on reverence. It was a fragment of its own armor, warm and humming, shaped by instinct into a cradle that fit the kaiju young perfectly, easing the strain of healing. Mara stared, disbelief warring with gratitude. She adjusted the makeshift cradle and eased the larger child into it, never stopping her song. The kaiju watched, learning. Its vast mind traced the pattern of her behavior, the way she soothed, the way she prioritized the young over herself. Something ancient shifted, a parameter rewritten. In orbit, feeds stabilized. The recording spread, passed from ship to ship, from species to species, not as propaganda, but as confession. Humans, it seemed, had walked unarmed into the shadow of extinction and taught it how to be gentle. Comments flooded secure channels, theories and prayers and raw reactions, colliding as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. "Share this," someone wrote. "If the universe is listening, let it hear this." The kaiju's eye closed, then opened, focusing on Mara with an intensity that made her breath hitch. A presence brushed her mind, not words but impressions. A question, vast and simple. Why? Mara swallowed and answered aloud, because that is what humans do when the world asks them something unbearable. "Because they're just kids," she said, voice steady, "and kids deserve to be safe." The kaiju considered this. Somewhere deep within Tethys Vault, protocols that had governed millennia of annihilation found a new exception. The galaxy felt it like a held breath released. The extinction event recalculated its purpose. Far above, a sensor pinged, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. A rival empire's armada had been waiting beyond the corridor, watching, measuring. They had just changed course. They were coming, and this time they were not afraid of the monster. They were afraid of what it was protecting.
The armada announced itself with the arrogance of those who had never been corrected. It poured into the corridor in disciplined silence, hulls marked with the sigils of the Car Dominion, a power that had outlived 3 galactic ages by learning when to hide and when to strike. Their ships were lean and sharp, built to kill gods by committee, and their admiral did not waste time with warnings. He had studied the feeds. He had seen the monster kneel. He had decided that anything that could be taught to kneel could be taught to die. Orders rippled through the Dominion fleet like a held breath, finally exhaled. Containment fields spun up, null mass anchors deployed, stitching space into a cage designed to bind entities larger than physics. The coalition screamed protests that went unanswered. Human channels flooded with frantic pleas and colder calculations. If the monster fell, the reprieve would end. If it fought, everything would burn. There was no doctrine for this. There was only a mother singing in the shadow of extinction and an empire that had decided to test the lesson.
On the moon, Tethys felt the cage closing and did not rise. Its eye remained on the fissure, on the children. It shifted its bulk to shield them, ancient armor aligning to present the strongest plates to the sky. The kaiju young stirred, sensing danger, and cried again, softer this time, a question more than a scream. Mara tightened her hold and sang through the tremor in her hands. She tasted copper and fear and resolve. She did not look away. The first shot struck the monster's flank and detonated into a lattice of light meant to unravel biological cohesion. Tethys absorbed it with a grunt that cracked the moon. The second shot followed, then a third, and the cage tightened, anchors biting into space-time like hooks. The monster did not retaliate. It endured. Analysts watching from 1,000 worlds whispered the same word with growing horror. It's letting them. The Dominion Admiral leaned forward, eyes bright. Increase output, break it. The order went out and the cage glowed white-hot. Tethys armor fractured, bioluminescent lines flaring as internal systems strained against limits set in an age before empires. The monster could end this, everyone knew it. The feeds showed weapon nodes spinning up and then throttling down, again and again, as if something within was refusing permission. Mara felt the refusal like a weight on her chest. She stopped singing. The silence was immediate and terrible. The kaiju young whimpered. The monster's eye snapped to her, alarm rippling across its vast form. She stood, shaking, and stepped forward again, placing herself where no one should ever stand. She raised her voice, not in song, but in fury sharpened by love. "Stop hurting him," she shouted at the sky. "You don't get to decide who lives by how scared you are."
Her words carried, not because of volume, but because the universe was listening now. The Dominion Admiral scoffed and ordered the final sequence. The cage collapsed inward, a kill command designed to crush stars into obedience. Tethys moved. It did not strike the armada. It did not break the cage. It turned, impossibly careful, and wrapped itself around the fissure, around the children, around the human who had stepped into the open. Its body took the full force of the collapse, armor shattering, internal light flaring and dimming as ancient systems failed. The moon split. Space screamed. The monster screamed too, not in rage, but in pain held back for someone else's sake. Across the sector, human channels went quiet. A single thought cut through the noise, raw and unadorned. Not like this. The Dominion Admiral watched the monster fall to one knee, then both, its massive frame bowed, bleeding light into the void. The Admiral exhaled, satisfied, and raised a hand for the finishing blow. His tactical display flickered. Then it changed. Human ships moved, not the fleets that had been battered and broken, not the carriers that still licked their wounds. Civilian hulls surged forward, engines screaming beyond safety, freighters and hospital ships and retrofitted transports burning their last reserves to close distance they could never cross in time. They formed a wall, absurd and fragile, interposing themselves between the armada and the moon. Their broadcasts overlapped into a single message, uncoordinated and unanimous. Stop. If you fire again, you fire on us. If you're hearing this now, you know why people tell this part to each other, and why they argue about it in comments and theories and late-night conversations, because this was the moment humanity stopped asking permission to matter. Share this with someone who still thinks courage needs armor. The Dominion Admiral laughed and gave the order anyway. The shot never landed. Space folded, the cage snapped, and from within the shattered light of Tethys something awakened that had been waiting for a reason.
What awakened was not a weapon, and not a god, and not a miracle in the way people like to use that word when they don't understand the cost. It was a protocol, ancient and precise, written into Tethys' vault at a time when extinction was common and mercy was rare. As the Dominion's kill shot dissolved into static against a wall of folded space, the monster's shattered light reassembled into lines of intent, and the universe felt a switch flip from endurance to judgment. The civilian wall held, engines screaming, hulls glowing as shields strained past design limits. Med ships vented atmosphere to keep power flowing. Freighters dumped cargo to shave mass. No one turned away. They broadcast names and faces and home coordinates, not as threats, but as proof. We are here. We choose this. The feeds caught Mara's voice again, hoarse and unbroken, singing into the chaos, her son pressed against her heart, the kaiju young tucked into the cradle of living armor. The monster's eye stayed on her as if anchoring itself to something small and unkillable. The protocol unfolded like a map. Gravity vectors reoriented. The anchors of the Dominion cage were not destroyed, they were repurposed. Space tightened where it should not, knitting a corridor that bent the Armada's own formation into a funnel of inevitability. Dominion ships tried to break away and found their trajectories politely corrected. Thrusters burned fuel into nothing. Orders stacked and canceled and stacked again as the Admiral realized, too late, that the monster had not learned how to kneel, it had learned how to teach. Tethys' vault rose, slowly, painfully, armor shedding in fragments that glowed and cooled into harmless dust. It did not strike the ships. It did not need to. It spoke, not in sound, but in pressure and pattern, a message carried on the same physics that had once made it unstoppable. The message was simple. This ends now. One by one, Dominion weapons went dark, not disabled, quieted. Their power bled off into the folded corridor and was returned as heatless light that washed over the civilian wall without harm. A carrier lost attitude and drifted, intact, its crew alive and staring at displays that refused to obey hostile commands. The Armada's cohesion unraveled into a collection of ships that could no longer agree on violence.
On the moon, the kaiju young stirred and reached out with a limb still too large, still too fragile. Mara took it without thinking, her hand disappearing against alien warmth. She laughed then, a short, incredulous sound that broke into tears. The monster felt that too, and something within it eased. The pain remained, the damage remained, but the choice had been made, and the protocol recognized the condition it had waited for across ages. Protected young, willing sacrifice, verified restraint. In the war room, someone whispered that this was impossible. Another person, quieter, said that humans made impossible things routine. Commentators would later argue whether it was the singing or the shielding or the civilian wall that mattered most. The truth was uglier and better. It was all of it, together, at once. The Dominion Admiral opened a channel at last, his voice stripped of certainty. "We will withdraw." The words tasted like ash. He expected annihilation anyway. Tethys' vault did not pursue. It turned back to the fissure, to the children, and the folded corridor unwound with careful finality, releasing the Armada to limp away, carrying a lesson it would pretend to misunderstand. Relief rolled through human space like a tide. Cheers broke out and died as quickly as they began, because everyone could see the cost. The monster sagged, systems dimming, the ancient light guttering. It had burned something it could not easily replace. The kaiju young pressed closer, sensing loss. Mara moved without permission, climbing onto the warm stone and laying herself against the monster's side, singing again, softer now,
the way you sing to someone who needs rest more than victory. If you're still with me, you know this is where the comments always explode, where people argue about whether she should have done that, whether anyone should be allowed that close to a being like this. Say what you think. Tell me your theory. The story has room for it. Tethysvald listened. The ancient light steadied, not bright, but enduring. The civilian wall powered down, drifting closer, a quiet constellation of ships that had chosen to stand. For a moment, the galaxy held its breath. Then a new signal cut through the calm, sharp and unmistakable, a distress code, human, from deep space. It carried a signature that made the monster's eyes snap open and Mara's blood run cold. It was a cradle.
The cradle signal was old, older than any human registry should have allowed, encoded with redundancies meant to survive centuries and still whisper home. It pulsed through the quiet like a heartbeat remembered, carrying the unmistakable pattern of an evacuation pod meant for one thing and one thing only: infants. On a dozen bridges, officers leaned forward, recognition cutting through exhaustion. Someone whispered that there hadn't been a cradle deployment in generations. Someone else said there had been one, quietly, a long time ago, and it had vanished with its escort. Mara felt the monster's attention shift before the feeds caught up. Tethysvald's eye fixed on the stars, ancient focus sharpening, and a tremor passed through its frame that was not pain. It was fear. Not for itself, for something small and fragile and far away. The kaiju young stirred, sensing the change, and made a sound that mirrored the cradle's pulse. The resonance snapped into place like a lock finding its key. The signal originated beyond mapped lanes, in a graveyard of debris left by a war nobody liked to remember. Human space had been younger then, louder, more reckless. Records were thin, survivors thinner. The cradle had been launched during a retreat that turned into a rout, its escort shredded by weapons that no longer existed. The official story ended with loss presumed. The unofficial story had always been worse. Someone had chosen to forget. Tethysvald did not hesitate. It rose again, careful and slower than before, and turned its bulk toward the source. The civilian wall shifted with it, engines reigniting, captains exchanging glances that carried a shared decision without words. If the monster moved, they moved. Coalition command stuttered and then fell silent as authority drained out of the moment. There were no orders to give that mattered. Mara climbed down from the stone, her legs unsteady, and pressed her palm to the monster's armor. She did not ask. She did not need to. The kaiju lowered itself just enough for her to keep contact, a bridge between scales and skin that felt impossible and necessary. She spoke softly, the way you do when you're telling a truth you don't want to be true. "We'll help. We won't let them be alone." The jump tore at reality, not the violent rupture of a fleet translation, but a controlled fold guided by instincts that had learned a new constraint. Protect the young, avoid collateral, arrive gently. Stars smeared and snapped back into focus around a field of wreckage that glittered like a fallen crown. Broken halls drifted, scarred and silent. The cradle floated among them, intact, its beacon steady and patient. Inside, the feeds showed movement. Human. Alive. A child, older than Mara's son, maybe 5 or 6, curled in the cradle's webbing, eyes wide and unblinking, watching the universe with the stillness of someone who had learned that noise attracts death. Readouts scrolled impossible survival metrics, recycling systems jerry-rigged beyond spec, nutrient paste stretched to the breaking point. A lullaby looped on a cracked speaker, distorted but recognizable, the same melody Mara had been singing without knowing why. The monster's breath hitched.
Vault reached out, not with claws, but with fields tuned to cradle mass and fragility. The pod drifted into its shadow and settled against living armor as if it had been built for it. The child inside did not scream. He raised a hand and pressed it to the transparent shell, mirroring the gesture Mara had made on the moon. Contact, a simple, devastating thing. Human ships converged, docking clamps and soft capture systems blooming like flowers. Med teams stood ready, hands shaking. When the cradle opened, air hissing into shared space, the child stepped forward on legs that should have failed and didn't. He looked at Mara and at the monster, and at the kaiju young peeking from behind armor, and made a choice that would be dissected for decades. He walked toward the biggest thing in the room and leaned against it. "It's okay," he said, voice thin and steady. "I'm here." Something broke open in the galaxy. If you've ever wondered why people say this story isn't about monsters or mothers or empires, this is why. This is the moment it stopped being hypothetical. Share it with someone who thinks hope is naive. Alarms flared again, softer this time, threaded with urgency. The cradle's logs finished decrypting, and the last entry scrolled into view, time-stamped with a date nobody liked to see. A warning written by a dying escort commander, words smeared by static and regret. Not one cradle, many, scattered. The monster turned its eye to the dark. There were more children out there, and the universe had just volunteered to help find them. The logs were a map written in apology. Cradles launched in panic, vectors randomized to evade pursuit, hope scattered like seeds into a hostile universe. Each entry carried a name, sometimes two, sometimes only a weight and a heartbeat pattern, sometimes nothing but a lullaby file uploaded twice because the first copy corrupted under fire. The escort commander's last line repeated until the buffer failed. If anyone finds them, don't be afraid of what comes to protect them. Vault absorbed the data in silence. The ancient light along its armor reconfigured, dimming in some places and flaring in others as dormant pathways awakened. This was what it had been built for. Not conquest or punishment, but guardianship scaled to a universe that forgot its young when wars ran long. The kaiju young pressed close, mirroring the monster's focus, learning without words. Mara watched the light shift and understood, with a clarity that hurt, that this was no longer about one moon or one child or one empire's arrogance. This was a hunt, not for enemies, for survivors. Human space moved faster than doctrine had ever allowed. Civilian networks rethreaded into search grids. Old navigation errors were reclassified as clues. Songs became signatures, lullabies threaded into sensor sweeps because someone realized that children listen even when machines fail. Aliens watched, stunned, as humanity did not ask permission or negotiate treaties. They asked for coordinates. They asked for volunteers. They asked who could hold a line while someone small was brought home. The Dominion tried to speak. Their channels went unanswered. The coalition convened an emergency council and discovered it had been outrun by events. The monster did not wait. It moved, folding space with a gentleness learned the hard way, arriving at debris fields and dead systems and forgotten orbits where cradles drifted like prayers unanswered. Some were empty, silent witnesses to endings no one could fix. Others answered back. Each recovery changed the monster, not weaker, different. Its movements grew more precise, its restraint deeper, its patience terrifying. It learned human signals, the way a raised hand meant stop and an open palm meant trust. It learned that sometimes the bravest thing a species could do was form a wall out of ships that were never meant to fight. It learned that humans sang to each other not because sound had power, but because connection did.
Mara traveled with it because someone had to explain the small things. She taught med teams how to approach children who had learned that silence kept them alive. She held hands and told stories and sang until her voice was gone, and sang anyway. Her son grew, watched by eyes that had seen stars die, and now watched him take his first steps with a gravity that bent nothing but attention. The child from the cradle learned to laugh again, a sound that made hardened captains turn away and wipe their faces. Not everyone welcomed this new order. A fringe alliance tried to strike a recovery site, betting that the monster would choose efficiency over mercy. They were wrong. Tethys Vault did not annihilate them. It took their weapons, their drives, their certainty, and left them adrift with enough supplies to survive and nothing else. The message traveled faster than fear. Do not hunt the young. Do not stand between humans and a child. The galaxy adjusted. Trade routes shifted. Borders softened around corridors marked safe by songs and civilian hulls. Alien species sent observers, and then caretakers, and then families, because it turned out that the instinct to protect was contagious when given permission. Councils debated whether to call the monster sacred. Humans called it what it was, a guardian who had learned what mattered. At the edge of mapped space, the final cradle waited, its beacon faint, its lullaby nearly gone. The approach was rough, radiation storms tearing at shields, debris fields blooming and collapsing without warning. The monster took the worst of it, armor glowing and cooling, systems straining but holding. Mara sang through the interference, voice a thread in a storm. The cradle opened to reveal twins, older than the others, holding each other with a ferocity born of too many nights alone. They did not cry. They stared. Mara knelt and held out her hands and waited. The kaiju young leaned forward too, curious and gentle. The twins took one step, then another. Behind them, sensors screamed. A mass had emerged from the dark, vast and unfamiliar, a rival guardian awakened by the same signal and answering with a doctrine that had never learned restraint. It turned toward the cluster of ships and children and sang back a different song, one written in annihilation. Tethys Vault placed itself between the threat and the cradles. It did not roar, it waited, and the universe learned that the next lesson would be taught in full view of those it was meant to protect. The rival guardian arrived like a verdict, its presence collapsing probability into a single brutal line. Where Tethys Vault bent space gently, this thing tore it, its armor a lattice of knives and voids, its song a command that had never been questioned because nothing had ever survived long enough to answer. It had awakened to the same call and reached a different conclusion. Protect the young by erasing the weak, preserve by purging. It advanced without hesitation, vectors aligning, the math of extinction clean and efficient. Human ships formed up without orders, engines humming into a familiar, fragile wall. Med bays sealed, cradles were moved to the center, wrapped in layers of hull and hope. Mara stood with the twins on one side and her son on the other, hands trembling, voice steady as she began to sing again, not because she believed it would stop what was coming, but because stopping would mean surrendering the one thing that had carried them this far. The kaiju young pressed against Tethys Vault, feeling the storm gather, trusting without understanding. The first exchange did not look like a battle. No beams, no explosions. The rival guardian projected a field that unraveled in tension, a weapon designed to make resistance pointless.
Tethysfault answered with stillness. It anchored itself to the civilian wall, to the cradles, to the humans who had taught it what restraint meant, and let the field wash over its armor. Systems flared and failed and rerouted. Ancient lights guttered. The monster did not step back. The rival guardian sang louder, confusion threading its command as resistance persisted where none should. It escalated, collapsing space inward, forcing a choice: save itself or save the children. The choice had already been made, long ago, on a broken moon, by a human who sang to a crying child. Tethysfault wrapped itself around the wall and the cradles and the small hands clinging to hope, taking the full weight of the collapse. Armor shattered into harmless dust, the ancient light dimmed to embers. The rival guardian recoiled, recalculating. This outcome did not exist in its doctrine. Mara's song broke, not into silence, but into voices. Human, alien, young and old, a chorus rose from ships and pods and stations, lullabies and counting songs and nonsense melodies stitched together by breath and fear and love. The sound carried through folded space, not as power, but as presence. The rival guardian hesitated, its song stuttering as inputs flooded with something it had never been built to process: choice without efficiency, protection without dominance, sacrifice without command. Tethysfault lifted its head for the last time and answered, not with a weapon, with memory.
It broadcast everything it had learned, not as data, but as experience. The weight of a human hand on warm armor, the rhythm of a lullaby matched to a heartbeat, the way a civilian wall forms when people decide that no one gets left alone. The rival guardian took it all at once and staggered, its lattice cracking as contradictions tore through a doctrine that had never allowed mercy to be logical. The collapse released. Space snapped back. The rival guardian did not explode. It unraveled, shedding weapons and commands and certainty until what remained drifted, inert and harmless, a monument to a lesson learned too late. The universe exhaled. Tethysfault sagged. Mara ran. She pressed her hands to cooling armor, tears blurring the ancient light fading beneath her palms. "No," she whispered, as if the universe could be reasoned with. The kaiju young cried, a sound that cut through celebration and relief like a blade. Human ships powered down and drifted closer, a vigil forming without words. The ancient light flickered, then steadied, not bright, not vast. Enough. Tethysfault did not rise again. It did not need to. It settled into a guardian's rest, systems transformed, no longer a roaming extinction failsafe, but a living sanctuary anchored where it mattered most. Around it, humans built stations and gardens and schools. Aliens brought families and names and new songs. The cradles emptied, one by one, into arms that waited. Years later, children would play along the warm stone and press their ears to it, swearing they could hear a heartbeat keeping time with the songs their parents sang at night. They would ask what the monster was, and the answer would always be the same. It was the one who learned. If you're hearing this now, share it with someone who believes power is about fear. Leave your thoughts, your theories, your arguments about what comes next, because the galaxy remembers this lesson, and it will need to be reminded again. The most dangerous thing in the universe was never the monster. It was the human who heard a child cry and chose to answer.